stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. I could not be more excited to introduce my guest for the podcast, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. Her name is Dr. Kate McLean, and she's a researcher at the University of Western Washington. And I was fortunate enough to have read an article that she was quoted in, an article by Christian Jarrett in the UK. And so I reached out to him to interview him on my podcast, didn't hear back from him right away, and decided it seemed silly to reach out to the person who wrote about the person that I actually wanted to talk to. So I did a little Google stalking and found Kate McLean and was thrilled to get a response almost immediately back that, yes, she'd love to be on my podcast. So Kate, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Sarah.
The first thing I always do when I introduce a podcast guest is I ask them to share something about themselves that most people wouldn't know. And the reason I do that is because I would really like our listeners to have a better idea of who you are and get some context for who you are before we start digging into your personal stories. So, do you have something to share?
I found this question really challenging, and I don't know if it's because I'm an open book or, but I've been trying to think, people in some parts of my life don't know this story, but other people do. So anyway, I'm choosing something from when I was younger because I feel like I share fewer stories about that. But I was, for many, many years, probably 15 years, I was a swim teacher for toddlers and very young children every weekend. And I loved it. And it was just a really, actually, now that I'm saying this, it made one of my first teaching experiences, I suppose. But I loved doing it. And it's not something I think a lot of people know that I did. So.
Oh, I love that. No, I would never have imagined that looking at your bio and your resume. So that's kind of perfect. What was it, do you think, that you loved about it?
I often got the kids that were really scared to be in the water. And it was just finding the trick to get them to love being in the water, because I love to swim and I love being in the water. So I really liked trying to get them to enjoy it, not just get them to do it, do the tasks, but get them to be interested and enjoy being in the water. And just like a little puzzle, like, what's this kid's deal? What do they need to have to be able to enjoy being in the water? It was just a lot of fun.
You definitely are a scientist.
Yeah.
That's right, like a puzzle. I think about that a lot when I'm teaching, when I'm doing any kind of coaching or training workshops and stuff. And one of the things that you just made me think of is a strategy that I used for my younger son. My older son had no problem jumping in the water, but the younger one was a little more tentative. And I remember blow up and making noises in the water so that it would be fun for him to put his face in the water. Did you use strategies like that?
Absolutely. Lots of songs and games and, distractions and all kinds of things. Yeah, absolutely. Especially with the littler ones.
I bet the parents just loved you.
when the kids weren't crying.
Yeah. That's always the trick. Wow. Well, that's terrific. And it probably really contributed a lot to your ideas about your hypothesis about your stories.
Teaching swimming?
Yes.
Well, I suppose it's a way in which families start to understand something about the traits or characteristics of their kids. So the kids that are jumping right in and fearless might have parents that are reinforcing those traits, and the ones who are a little bit more timid might get a lot of, oh, remember when you were in swim class and you wouldn't go in the water for 6 weeks and that kind of thing. That's a possibility for sure. Families will be doing that.
Absolutely. I think about that a lot in terms of how we set our children up for certain successes and certain ideas about who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so for our listeners, why don't you tell us a little bit about your hypothesis and where you're going with your research right now? Because this is why I wanted to talk to you.
So I think what interests me about family stories is that there's sort of there's a lot of components to them, but the two that are maybe most interesting is that they are one of the first ways that children are identified. So one of the first mechanisms or ways that they define themselves. So as parents are telling stories about their children with their children, the kids are learning what kind of person they are. They're timid or they're brave or whatever the traits are. And so it's really a powerful and important way for kids to begin the process of self-definition and identity development. And a lot of times that can go really well. So the stories that are told are stories that make sense to the child, and they continue to have these kinds of stories and feel coherent in who they are. And then sometimes the family stories start to not fit the identity, especially as kids move into adolescence and emerging adulthood. And so then family stories can be constraining. And I think that interests me, the ways that stories can both support our development and be opportunities and avenues for development and confirming who we are, and they can provide obstacles for development. Those are the two things that I think interest me the most right now.
So how do you research something like this? I mean, do you have a control group? Do you have specific observations you're making? I mean, how do you research something like this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't do a ton of experiments. I've done a few, but not a ton. I do a lot of this work. I did a lot of observation. So observing families telling stories together and doing a lot of descriptive work. What kinds of stories are told? And then something that I've been doing over the last few years is after people, whether it's strangers or mothers and children or entire families, after they engage in some kind of conversational task that I record in the lab, then afterwards asking them what it was like. So giving them a survey or interviewing them to get their perspective on the conversation. And that is really useful because things come out there that weren't visible. So they might say, yeah, I remember when my mom said this, I hate that story, but I didn't tell her that because she likes that story, So that post-observation assessment is really important for understanding how people are negotiating or thinking about the stories their families are telling about them.
Wow. I can imagine that being really powerful because I mean, based on the podcast alone, with your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will, how other people tell your stories, especially when you're younger and still kind of defining yourself. Mm-hmm. Wow.
It's key. Yeah, I think it's something that it's a great power that people have to tell other people's stories that is a power I think people don't think about very much. So that you really are defining someone in the way that you talk about them or share their stories. And that happens a lot with families, but it happens with couples and friends and on all kinds of interpersonal dynamics where other people are telling our stories. And the way they do that is important, I think, to how we think about ourselves.
Well, it's funny because when I talk to my coaching clients and with this podcast, I talk about how the stories you tell change the perceptions of the people around you. Mm-hmm. So if I tell a story that seems out of character for somebody who knows me and they hear the story, it may shift their perception of me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I hadn't really turned it around, that when I tell a story about somebody else, that it could shift the perception of that person. I mean, I know that it shifts the perception of the people that are hearing the story, mm-hmm. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm immediately going back to the stories that I share about both of our boys and my sister and my brother. And wow, I mean, that has a lot of unintended consequences right there.
And sometimes that can be great, right? So sometimes the stories that you're telling might really resonate with the person that they're about. So if you're telling a story about your son, he might say, yeah, that's exactly who I am. That feels good to hear that story that confirms my idea of myself. So sometimes that it's still powerful, but it can be a positive, validating experience. But not always, right? So and people also, I think within families in particular, what's interesting is that people do change. So we there's some aspects of us when we're children or younger that may begin to fade away. So maybe we're really irresponsible when we're a teenager, and then we kind of get it together in emerging adulthood or young adulthood, but the family is still telling these stories about how irresponsible you are. And that can be frustrating at the minimum.
At the minimum, yeah. I can imagine, especially if you're younger and you don't have the strength of character to say that's not me anymore, and make sure your behavior demonstrates that.
Right.
But at a younger age, you may start to think, well, maybe they're right. Maybe I am irresponsible.
Right. And it's also hard, even if you think that you're not, if you've changed in some way that other people aren't recognizing. I think at a more extreme end, it's actually pretty challenging to really and truly change unless that's recognized by other people. So I don't know that this is more of a hypothesis, but I don't know that really shifting your identity or the way that you think about yourself is possible if other people don't see that as well. So I think we can't just construct ourselves in our heads. We need to have that self validated by other people. And it doesn't have to be the family. I mean, other people may give you the validation that you need, but I think that just thinking that you're a certain way without other people seeing that is pretty challenging for the self.
Well, and I think it's specific to stories as opposed to getting feedback on an evaluation or something, saying that you are this way or you are that way, but actually hearing a story that demonstrates you in that character that isn't necessarily what you would consider an accurate portrayal.
Well, especially because stories have sequences of events and interpretations, so it's something that supposedly really happened. So how accurate a story is a little bit of a different question, but they certainly have this weight of there's this thing that happened, you can't deny it, right? You can't deny that you didn't do that. So they do carry more weight, more power in defining us, I think, and lots of my colleagues think that's why we're interested in them, because they're so weighty.
Well, yeah, when you think about evaluations alone, even as an adult, and the confidence that can take a hit as a result of that, when you did this, you were A. And I'm just thinking immediately of an example of a really bad fit when I had a job a few years back, and my boss in an evaluation told me that, and she told a story, when you did this, you, what did she call? You resisted authority. And I remember my first instinct going, what? Aren't we supposed to resist authority? I mean, don't I have my own mind, and aren't I able to explain something? But the way that she told the story made me question whether I was doing what I had done with the intent of resisting, or with the intent of being innovative or creative.
So that's the interpretation. So the event is the same, right? Whatever happened in that moment, but the interpretation of this person and you were at odds.
Well, clearly. We were at odds a lot in those 2 years. So tell me, do you have children, Kate?
I don't, no.
Okay, so I'm curious about if there are stories from your life when you were a kid. Do you have siblings?
I have a half brother, yeah.
So do you have stories from when you were younger that you heard other people tell that kind of have that you go back to an application as you do your research?
Yeah, I mean, my dad was a very serious storyteller, and there are lots of stories told about me, repeated ones, and just many, many. One of the ones that was resonant when I was working on this family story stuff actually was funny. Now I can't even remember all the order of this. The story got so mixed up, but basically, I had been told that I was a colicky baby. And I remember that I babysat a colicky baby in college, and that's when I realized what colic was really about. And I thought, oh gosh, how terrible for my parents that I was this way when I was an infant. And I was telling both of them about that recently, that, I remember you saying this, and they both vehemently disagreed that I was a colicky baby. So they definitely had told me that story at one point and then decided that had changed. So now I have no idea whether I was or not. And it's just kind of a funny, everyone's story evolves, and now we don't know what the real story is. So it's kind of become a joke, of who knows, what I was like as an infant now.
Was she colicky? Was she not colicky?
Who knows? So, yeah, I mean, but I think generally the stories that were told and are told about me are they are pretty resonant with my own identity. So I don't feel a whole lot of, that's not what I'm really like. Maybe that's why I had a hard time coming up with something people don't know about me. So I think the stories that my family tells are actually pretty consistent with how I view myself, which is nice.
So what's one of those stories? I mean, besides not being a colicky baby.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, I mean, it's funny, I can't think of a specific one right now. There's so many stories about my industry, like being very busy. We just actually discovered an old audio tape of me when I'm probably about 3 years old, just talking and singing. It was kind of around the time when that was an exciting thing, recording. Recording has been, the late 70s, early 80s. And at one point you can hear me running down the hallway and you can hear my little feet patter, 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 and just busy. I was always very busy and kind of loud. My mom called me motor mouth, which I tell my students now because they tell me I speak too quickly. I'm trying to speak slowly right now.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you. So yeah, just being busy and talking and always into something and, kind of just industrious, I think, highly active.
Wow, that's funny. I can't really remember any stories about me, but I remember stories about my brother and my sister that people told.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell stories about our boys. And for instance, I talk about at birth and even pre-birth. We have 2 boys. They're 2 years and 9 months apart. Mm-hmm. And the older one, when I was pregnant with him, was a perfect circle. He was like a basketball. So until I was probably like just about to give birth, I was probably at 8 months or 36 weeks, you couldn't even tell from behind that I was pregnant. And I'm tiny. I'm 5'2". I weighed 103 pounds when I got pregnant with Jacob, and I gained 23. And it was all baby. It was all in the middle. And literally you couldn't tell until I would turn. And then all of a sudden you would hear people gasp when I turn. And he came out smiling. I mean, he was such an easy baby. He went through a few nights where he was overstimulated and what I would consider colicky, but because it was such a short period of time, I wouldn't say that to somebody who actually had a colicky baby, because I think it would be disrespectful in some ways. And anyway, so he was really easy. And when I was pregnant with Max 2 years later, he was always sideways. I still didn't gain much more. I think I gained 33 with him, but he was always at an angle. So you could tell because I would have these weird lumps from behind, either on the left or on the right. You could see these weird lumps. And when he came out, I kind of expected him to be similar to Jacob, kind of mellow, and he came out screaming. And all of his pictures, all the pictures that my husband took of Max at birth were captioned Mad Max.
Oh.
And we had decided his name was Sam up until he was born. And then we both immediately, like within minutes of hearing him screaming, we said, well, that doesn't sound like a Sam. And I remember we tried all for the next couple of days when I was in the hospital to make him a Sam. And he just was not a Sam. And he knows this story. Mm-hmm. And he fits it. I mean, he still fits it. He's still mischievous. Mm-hmm. He is still, when he was in, I don't know, first, second, third grade, people would say, oh, you're Max's mom. And then they'd have this, oh, I have the funniest Max story, because he was so charming, but also mischievous. And I wonder now, I mean, what would you say about those stories?
So the first thing I'm thinking is, I wonder how much the stories about him that began when he was born shaped the behavior that you later saw. So probably there's some temperamental individual differences that are, predisposed, and he's got a personality or a set of characteristics that might be, I liked your idea, he's always sideways. So maybe he's got some temperamental characteristics that make him always a little bit sideways. But then one of the interesting things about temperament is that we respond to babies' temperament. So that might be predisposed, but we react to them, and the way that we react can further solidify those temperaments or shape them a little bit. So if you're reacting with this Mad Max story, does that kind of confirm those predispositions that he had, or even elaborate those predispositions so the stories serve as a way to elaborate those temperamental characteristics? Might be a way that kind of kept him in that sideways characteristic.
Right. Well, and we do that to our pets. Mm-hmm. I mean, we respond to what we see as certain character traits. Mm-hmm. And actually, that just reminded me of when our older son was an infant. I think he was 6 months old when we moved from Washington, D.C. to Montana. Mm-hmm. And I remember he had a little cough, like he just went, ah. And my husband and I both immediately gave him attention. Mm-hmm. And he looked at us and he smiled. And a few minutes later, when we weren't paying attention, he did a fake cough. Uh-huh. And we just started laughing. And
yes, absolutely. That we respond to these behaviors, and then that can validate them, reinforce them in some way.
Huh. Well, that says a lot about parenting. It's not just about the stories either, but I'm sure when they hear those stories, like you said, it either confirms or it frustrates.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. And early on, it's likely to, they're different. If you're talking about sharing stories with a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old, there you're really constructing, right? You're really helping them to understand who they are. And that's a pretty complicated task when you're that age. So they really need those stories and that support in narrating themselves. And then as they begin to have a little bit more autonomy and cognitive complexity and skill, then they can start to compare the stories or think about their own self-definitions in relation to others. But when they're that little, they really need parents and other people to help them to narrate themselves.
Have you had a chance to do any kind of longitudinal studies about this?
I have with older people. So there's a ton of research on early childhood development and narration, actually, and there's quite a lot of longitudinal studies. My own studies have been more in the adolescent, emerging adult range, and looking, I did a very tiny, small study looking at family stories following a target adolescent for a couple of assessments afterwards, and checking in on them in terms of the way that the family is telling stories about that child. How did that child think about them? But the literature in early childhood certainly shows that parents have a very large role to play in helping children to construct their first stories about themselves and their autobiographical memories.
Well, I'm a little puzzled because I've seen a lot about child development, and I even many years ago in the late 80s, early 90s, did some human development coursework at Colorado State University. And I don't remember hearing that. Mm-hmm. And it's really, really important. Is this relatively new?
Well, the first studies were really being done in the first studies were probably in the mid 80s, but it was really some of the big ones came out in the 90s. So it was probably happening while you were studying. And then, as with any research area, it does take a while to accumulate the research, particularly when you're doing longitudinal studies. So now it's pretty well, it's in any intro development textbook, for example. But it did take some time for that to emerge as a really prominent part of child development. But it is now. It's definitely viewed as a central piece of what's going on with kids in early childhood. There's a phenomenon called childhood amnesia, where when we're later children or adults, we don't remember the first couple of years of our lives. So when your first memory is usually somewhere around the age of 3 to 4. So a lot of cognitive psychologists were interested in why that was. And so that is part of what inspired some of the research on how do parents talk about the past, about their children's past with them at that very early age.
Wow. Do you have any particular research that you would want to share, something that you saw in a particular family or child? Obviously, we can't use names.
Yes. One, I'm not sure, this is a little bit different than, it's related to what we're talking about, but it does shift the conversation a little bit. One of the most interesting studies that I did, so I collect narratives, in any study that I'm doing, I'm either asking people to share stories in conversation or in some kind of interview or survey. So I've read a lot of narratives. And one study I did, I asked college students, so they were 18, 19, 20 years old, to narrate stories that their parents had told them about their own lives. So the parents' own personal stories. So I asked, give me your mom's low point, your mom's high point. I asked for a transgression your mom told you. And these narratives were so elaborated. They were long and detailed, and even when they didn't have one, so they were more likely to not have a transgression, not surprisingly. So my mom's never told me a transgression that she committed. But even then, they would write about why they thought it was that they didn't have the story from their mom. And they were just really interesting narratives to read. And I think what was being captured by that method was, at this age, emerging adulthood, the kids were just beginning to see that their parents were their own people. They had their own lives and their own identities, whereas before they just been parents. And I think that shift is a really interesting developmental shift, particularly in thinking about family storytelling, because when you have a more complex view of your parent, you might understand more of their behavior. Why are they telling this story about me, for example? So that shift in seeing parents as people is how I termed the phenomenon, is a pretty interesting one. And they were really intense, articulate, detailed stories. And that doesn't always happen, especially when people are doing a study for credit, and they just want to get it done. But they really took their time in that study.
Was there any one student's story that really stuck out for you?
There were a couple stories I remember about the father. So I asked for stories about mothers and fathers being a veteran, so having war experience. Mm-hmm. And for one of them, the war of Iraq would have been the war that for most of them, but one of them talked about Vietnam. So this person had a much older parent. And the way that those stories were framed was their parents really being vulnerable. And that vulnerability was new for the children of those parents, to understand their parents' experiences, the real low points and vulnerable low points. And I remember them coming out a little bit and talking about experiences of war. And also those were stories that weren't shared early on. So they were stories that were shared when the kids were older. And those seemed to be pretty impactful for the kids who told them.
Wow. So waiting to tell your children about the scary or negative experiences that you had. Mm-hmm. So that they can see you in that light, as opposed to thinking that you know everything. And
Right. Yeah. And these were stories about, addiction and feeling suicidal and, heavy stories. So it makes sense that you wouldn't share those with the 7-year-old,
Right. Right.
But important stories to share. I mean, important stories for kids to hear, to understand their parents and understand, how the world works and how to cope with different kinds of things that may come their way. So they're certainly, family stories or personal stories are not always positive and happy. And the negative ones are really ones where people can learn a lot about themselves and other people.
And there's probably something comforting about knowing that you're not alone in your feelings of loneliness or depression. If you can see that somebody that you admire and respect, a parent that is always the strong one, and you can see that they go through things like that too, there must be something a little bit comforting about that.
Yeah, particularly if they're not in that low spot anymore, right? So they're telling a story about having moved through that. That could be quite useful. Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. So now I'm even more curious about, obviously, with your dad being a storyteller, you already had an interest in stories.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Is there one pivotal moment when you were in school or just out of school or just getting started in research that you realized that this was it? This was something that was really going to totally inspire you?
Yeah, my students often ask, how did I know I wanted to do this? And I don't have it was very, I was not as well thought out and planful in my career development, which I think is good for them to hear, actually. But I was working in college. I was working in my professor's lab in her research, and she studied attachment theory and how parents and infants and children attached to each other. And I was doing interviews for her. So I was interviewing mothers about their caregiving experiences. And then we would take the interviews and read them intensely and try to quantify them in some way, which is what I do now, is quantify narrative data. And I had no idea that was a job, that's how you could spend your time, reading books and writing papers and then asking people for their most intimate experiences in their lives, asking them to narrate those for you. And that just completely hooked me as that's absolutely how I want to spend my time. And so I actually my path was really more about the methodology than the questions. The questions about identity development came after I decided I wanted to focus on people's stories. And I just remember sitting in that, in the classroom, in the lab meetings, and just, with these thick interviews and just thinking, this is so interesting. I can't believe people tell us this stuff. And then we get to really appreciate it and think about it and try to understand the human condition from these stories. And I just thought that was amazing. So that resonated. And I'm sure that resonated because I was surrounded by stories my whole life and knew that words and language and narrative were really important pieces to living a good life. So I'm sure that was influential also.
It sounds to me like in that moment when you're sitting in the room, I could see you sitting in a room reading through an intense narrative. And it sounds to me like you had an innate sense of responsibility as a result of reading this person's narrative, a particular person's narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually the first thing when I start a new lab with new students, the first thing we talk about is the ethics. And part of the ethics have to do with, leaving all the narratives in the lab, just sort of practical matters. But also people's stories are precious and we should treat them like they're precious. And I think the other thing that was influential in realizing that was I did a lot of the interviews myself. So I wasn't just reading them, but I actually conducted interviews. So I wasn't just reading them. And so when you're sitting in the room with someone sharing, and they're sharing their most intimate moments with you face to face, that really makes you realize how important these narratives are. So I do think there's an ethical imperative and a responsibility to treat people's stories as precious and to respect them. And I feel very lucky that people will share their stories and that I get to sort of have the honor of appreciating them and using them in ways that I hope are positive.
That's exactly how I feel. I just find it to be such an honor that people would share certain stories with me. So that comes back to a question that popped into my head as you were talking about that. One of the things I struggle with in my podcast is that sometimes when I try to get a story from somebody, I get a description, I get something that's not necessarily a story.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any specific questions you ask, or are you calling certain narratives a story even if it's not really a story? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And I feel like I've been doing a very poor job. I haven't given you any specific stories.
No, you've actually, I love the story of sitting face to face with somebody and asking them questions and having them share your story. That's vivid. And the idea that you would sit there and read through somebody's story and realize the responsibility you had in helping others as a result of having this story in front of you, that moment of choice of this is what I'm going to do. That's a great story. So I'm not complaining. It's perfect.
So yes, I know exactly what you mean. And one thing is with a podcast, you're interviewing someone. And so if someone's taking a survey, for example, they can pause and think about it. But this probably isn't very good for a podcast, but I do really think the importance of silence is big. So when I do interviews or when I train students to do interviews, it's not a regular conversation. So you ask someone a question and just let them sit and think for a little while, let them absorb the question and consider what they might want to share. I do try to be as specific as possible. So there are lots of protocols that my colleagues and I use. So asking someone for the low point of their life, for example, or the high point of their life. Another prompt that was developed by a colleague of mine, Jefferson Singer, is the self-defining memory, which is defined as something very vivid and emotional, something you've thought about many times. And if you wanted someone to understand who you are as a person, it's the kind of story that you would share. So those are really, the instructions are fairly detailed. But I think with the greater specificity of the question, you get better narratives. But it's also the case that people don't always give what I would call a narrative. So they'll give a description of themselves, maybe traits or characteristics, which aren't a narrative, or they might give kind of a generalized event representation. So, every Christmas we used to always blah, blah, blah is not really a story. It's like a script almost.
Right.
And so some people have a harder time accessing specific stories. But many theories about why that might be. I'm not sure I'm prepared to offer my own theory because I think there's a lot of factors that go into that. But certainly some people have a harder time with that question than others.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely what I've found. And also contextually, it seems like people struggle sometimes if you try to ask about a specific story out of the context of the conversation you're having.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. If you're sort of moving and you're starting to share stories and you're in that mindset and you're thinking about certain aspects of your life, the story that they'll, arise to the surface more easily.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of stories, is there one more that you would want to share about a time when you realized that it was storytelling specifically that you wanted to study? Was it in the sharing of a story or hearing of somebody else's story? This is a story that I have shared before. When I was interviewing for graduate school, I applied mostly to work with people who did attachment research because that's what my advisor did in college. And I was interviewing with the person who did become my graduate school advisor who didn't study attachment, but she studied stories. And it was kind of I just decided to apply kind of without a lot of thought into it. And I was in her lab and I was the interview. So, I'm kind of trying to be professional and impress her. And she leaned back and she said, "So did your parents smoke pot when you were little?" And she asked because she was doing a study about how parents talk about transgressions to their kids. And she thought that would be an interesting
prompt, speaking of specific prompts, because she was at Santa Cruz and there's a whole population of people with teenage children who likely did smoke pot when their kids were small. And so it would be it was a meaningful question that she could ask. And I, of course, was a little shaken by that because I was trying to be professional, and my parents certainly did smoke pot when I was a kid, especially my dad, all the time. So, it was also, I relaxed, and we started to talk about that, what does it mean when parents have stories like this? What does it mean for child development? At what age do you talk about these things, and what are the other contexts? And we just got into this great conversation, and it was one of those moments where I thought, oh, this is going to be fun. This is going to be an interesting experience.
Yeah, no kidding. So I'm imagining you sitting there and having a little bit of a shocked expression on your face.
Yes, definitely. Very much.
So how did that end? Did she shake your hand and walk away? What was the room like?
I think pretty quickly we realized that we liked each other and that we were gonna, at least this is my recollection, it'd be funny to ask her. I think that it was like, oh yeah, we're on the same page to some extent in the way that we approach the world. She's a very, but she did a wonderful job at giving me professional development, but also just a really down to earth, relaxed person. And I think it ended well. I thought, yeah, I want to come here. I want to work with her, and she's doing interesting things. This is fun. And I think in some ways, the question was about my own life. And so the idea that we're studying stuff that matters, that we have thoughts about and experiences with, and of course you want to be careful not to be too biased about your own life, but she was just right out there. Of course, we all have experiences that we think are worthy of study, and how do those experiences shape or form our ideas? And that was pretty meaningful, I thought, to me too.
Wow. I can imagine just so much application with the work that you're doing right now. And hearing you say that whole, first of all, starting with that sense of responsibility at hearing other people's stories and recognizing the importance and value of them, but also the application, especially when we were talking about toddlers and how we tell the stories about them and how that shapes their own internal narrative. Mm-hmm. There's so much application for the work you're doing. Are you seeing much of that yet, or are you still really focused on the research part of it?
I think that there is application. Researchers who are basic researchers like myself are always a little reticent to say, here's what you should do without, the proper kinds of experimental designs and control groups and all that. But I definitely, I give talks in the community that are for families and parents about the importance of storytelling. I feel I have no qualms about saying storytelling is important and thinking about how to engage in storytelling at different developmental stages. And I have colleagues who do more clinically oriented work and are applying some of the ways that we think about adults' storytelling patterns and how that relates to things like mental health. So I think there is application of the work that we're all doing to people's lives. It certainly makes sense to people when we talk about it. People get it, what we're talking about. Everyone understands what stories are and usually thinks they're important. So yeah, I think that there is beginning to be good amount of application.
I love hearing that. I have to tell you, Kate, that when I saw that article by Dr. Christian Jarrett about what you were doing and that the context of telling a story and how that shapes who you are, shapes your identity, your capital S self. Mm-hmm. When I read that, and then I reached out to you and I read a little bit of your research, whatever I could access easily online, it was such a relief to me and so much confirmation, because I'm pushing up against my 100th episode of this podcast. And all I could think was just the name of the podcast alone is an application of the work you're doing.
Well, thank you. That's wonderful to hear, and congratulations on getting close to 100. That's amazing.
Thank you. So I am so grateful, first of all, for the the respect that you give this study. It is so important. And I think people don't even realize how important it is yet. And they will over the next 10 years. It's storytelling is definitely becoming a bigger buzzword in this world. And
Yeah.
I think as a result of that, people are starting to look at it more in just individual storytelling and what that means for us.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that it wouldn't have gotten the attention had it not started being a buzzword in the business world.
Yes. Now there's narrative economics, I just learned.
Oh my gosh, that's a little frightening. Well, I think about narrative in generalizations for generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
And what a millennial story is versus what a baby boomer story is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's some similarities and some differences, I think.
Definitely. But I think, again, you come back to this whole idea of when you tell that certain story about yourself, you're confirming your own identity and impressing upon someone else a different perspective about who you are.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
Wow. Well, this has been a meaty conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Kate. And for our listeners, I will have some more information about Dr. McLean on my website, on the blog post associated with this podcast. You can learn more about her research. And I am just so grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going